about the mindset of being a favorite versus being an underdog? How does that impact the way we coach?
So funny that you asked that right now. We're on the heels of the U.S. Open, and one of the American hopefuls, Tommy Paul, I was watching him play throughout the tournament, and he played so well up into the quarters, I think. And when he was behind, he was unbelievable. But every time he got ahead, he just sort of crumbled. And I just kept saying, you got to play with the lead, dude. You got to be able to play with the lead. And it is a completely different skill set, I think. I think there are a couple of things that happen when you're the favorite or you're ahead. And number one is you can not prepare as much as you should have. You can get distracted. You cannot take the care and the attention and the focus that you might apply when you're behind. But the other piece of that is you can feel all of the pressure, all of the self imposed, typically, pressure from what expectations are around you. And you can try too hard and you can squeeze too tight and you can think too much. And so it can go one of either way. I think when you're coming from behind or you're playing without those expectations to win, you get an opportunity to maybe focus more on exactly what it is and not so much on the external entrapments. And when you're expected to win or you're ahead, then you start to think about all of these outside noises and outside factors, and it can get in the way of your performance. And each requires a very different skill set.
A couple of practical tips for when you're the favorite team.
First of all, we would always talk about how no one else's opinion of us mattered nearly as much as our opinion of ourselves. We would begin right there. Have we done the work? Are we prepared? Do we know what the game plan is? Is everybody on the same page? Do we know why we're playing? And when those things lined up, then they sort of cancel out
So that's
those.
really going back to your goals, right? And your
Yeah,
whys.
yeah, are who we want to be.
Okay.
That was always way more important for us than what we wanted to do, because who we wanted to be drove the what we wanted to do. Clearly, we were going to do the right things in practice to develop the skills that were necessary to be champions. But there's so much human stuff that connects all those things that are required strategically or fundamentally or technically to be a champion. And so if you can focus on that, the who of it, and I always say, Simon Sinek is it starts with why guy, but I've never seen a why that's not connected to a who. And so if we can go back to that individually and collectively about who we want to be as a group together, then some of those things that you can squeeze too tight on and think too much about just minimize. They just fall into the backdrop because you're trying to behave in a certain way.
Obviously, by the time a player gets to the University of Oklahoma, they've got some resilience in their life. They've accomplished a lot of things. But those same traits are true. I was thinking, I went to my granddaughter's middle school volleyball game, and they're a brand new team and have some talent. And they would get behind and they would battle back and they would get ahead and then they would crumble, right? Because they just don't know they don't know how to win. They don't know how to feel when there's pressure. They don't know how to respond to that. And you're saying like the key is to go back to who we are, who our identity is. And a lot of times, Sherri, that has to happen outside of me, right? It's somebody reminding me of that. We talk about how if I'm dysregulated, it's important for me to regulate, but it's a lot easier if someone comes alongside and co-regulates me. So if you have a teammate, a player that begins to get out of control or begins to get overly stressed, it's probably best for a teammate to come alongside of them, obviously a coach, but someone else has got to help them to regulate back as
Yeah,
well.
I think that's why the environment, the air is what we called it, of a locker room is so important. If the air can be the same, regardless of what's at stake, then that regulation, to use your word, Joe, that regulation happens more quickly and with less resistance in the moment because it's sort of been raised in this temperature. And I think that's where teammates become so important. Maybe even to a certain extent more than coaches. Of course, coaches can escalate a situation. We can convince a team that they can't win. We can take a mediocre situation and turn it into a horrible one. There are lots of things coaches can do that are not helpful. But the power of teammates is incredibly impactful. I've watched teammates override coaches because of the environment that they create among themselves and how they link themselves together with that consistent expectation.
Yeah, that's great, Sherri. One of the things I'm trying to get across to coaches is the value of doing that proactively instead of just reactively. So, on the front end, to teach players how to be regulated, to give them regulation strategies, to have the air of the locker room being a co regulating, hey, we're going to help one another, keep our minds open for business. We talk about how the brain actually shrinks, the smart brain actually shrinks when we get traumatized. And when a player is exhausted, they're going to have trouble thinking, they're going to make mistakes. If a player gets distracted by the refs, they're going to make mistakes. There are all kinds of things like that that create the tension that make us less effective. And what we're saying is the good coaches are addressing those things on the front end.
Well, I think you teach responses just like you teach pivots and left hand flick passes and how to block out. I used to ask our guys, what happens a lot in the game of basketball? And invariably they would say, shooting. No, it doesn't. It doesn't happen a lot. How many times might you shoot in a game? 6, 7 at the most. And then they would say dribbling. No, that's not a good thing either, unless it's the point guard typically. Passing, no, that's a lost art. We go through all the things. And I would say, you know what happens a lot in basketball is you run down here, and then you turn around and you run down there, and then you turn around and you run back down there. And if you can get really, really good at that, then we have a chance to be successful. But you know what else happens a lot? A whole bunch of stuff that you wish didn't. Like your teammate shoots an air ball, or you get called for a moving screen, or the other team banks in a shot at halftime. All these things happen consistently, things that you didn't plan for and you didn't want. And if you can learn how to respond to those, if you can get good at responses, then we have a great chance to be successful because it's going to happen a lot. And the team who's the best at the things that happen the most is going to win. And so as coaches, you train those responses. And what does that look like? It looks like body language. Never going like this when a ref makes a call that you disagree with. Never looking the other way and rolling your eyes when a teammate gives you a bad pass that went out of bounds. And you can't just not do those things. I think that sometimes as coaches where we make our mistake, we have to give players something to do in place of those things because the mind doesn't work that way. It's like don't eat, don't eat, don't eat. Your mind here's eat. And so you give them something to do. And we would tell our players to sprint to the guy who just fell down on the floor and help them up. We had a touch rule. We had a positive body language that we went through that was just as specific as our start, stops, and turns lines. I mean, those things mattered. And you teach those, you reinforce those as coaches in practice and in games, and players learn how to respond better.
Yeah, you can get a playbook off the internet. You can't get what you're talking about off the internet. That comes from the sages, the experience, and coaches recognizing there's more to this game than just the X's and O's.
And it's hard because it's an all the time thing. You can't say it at a preseason meeting and then not reinforce it every single day in practice, every single drill of every single day in practice, because that's where the muscle memory takes over. The mind and the body takes over because of those repetitions. That's what makes it hard.
Yeah, and that response, there actually is a part of the brain that operates where that repetitive muscle memory works. And in that, if that's not trained, then when those experiences happen, it's going to run somewhere else. And if we have trained that experience, then when my teammate shoots an air ball that looks ridiculous, I'm going to respond by that trained experience because I've got those neural reactions.
We all have a strong and weak voice that we carry around in our head. And it doesn't matter how much we've done. It doesn't matter how many championships we've won, how much success we've had. We all have that strong voice that says, you got this, you can do this, you've been here a million times. And that weak voice that says, can you really, who do you think you are? What makes you think you could do this? And we have to learn, all of us, not to make that weak voice disappear. I don't think that's possible, but we learn to hear it and make the choice to replace it with the strong voice. And it's that replacement that really makes the difference. And typically you learn how to do that by both a physical and a verbal mantra. You say something and you do something, and it'll just shift your body. The mind's an amazing machine in that way. And when you give it that cue, it'll just shift from weak to strong.
That's good. And that plasticity, that ability for the mind to reshape and reform is really key for kids coming out of trauma. As if they've experienced negative responses to adversity and people quitting on them when they make a mistake. And so you're rewiring all that in the way that you're coaching.